Hey everyone. Excuse me. So we're gonna do 789 today, and then that'll be it. You'll be on to the exam. So Unit 7 is gonna be 1930 to 1952. Um, that'll be what we do for that. Sorry, I'm getting weird feedback in my ears. Okay. All right. Excuse me. We'll start with the Great Depression. When we ended before, what the last week, we talked a little bit about the causes of the Great Depression. So we'll just go, the Great Depression happened, Hoover didn't really do anything to deal with it, and then we're kind of stuck. And we go, all right, what are we going to do? And that decision is elect FDR. And so FDR wins pretty overwhelmingly in the election of 1932, and he proposes the New Deal. Excuse me. The New Deal has three main parts. They're the three R's: relief, recovery, and reform. This is also an appropriate picture for FDR because he's in front of the media. That's a pretty substantial thing that he will do. Excuse me. He'll use the media to his advantage. And there's all sorts of modern connections you could make through this. And I would look at how do people use the media as it's coming about. Radio is going to be the big thing that people really hadn't used before, and not to this level. And so his fireside chats will be pretty significant. Excuse me. His first 100 days popularized the idea of we care about what the president does in their first 100 days. And that's because he immediately starts with a banking holiday. He shuts stuff down and he needs to get the banks under control. And I would argue we're a little cynical today. And so if I floated this theory out to you, or this proposition, which is, all right, I'm going to close all the banks. Everyone in America is worried that the banks have destroyed all their money and lost it and their fortunes are over. So let's close all the banks and then open them up later. And then your response would be, okay, but if we open them up later, won't people just run on the banks and take everything? And that seems like something we would do as cynical people. And FDR, to his credit, convinces the people we're only going to open up the ones that are good. And once they open up, don't worry about it. It's going to be fine. And they listen to him and things are fine. And so that's kind of interesting for us to think about. For the relief, the key for relief is we want to get money to people. I mentioned this before. On the end of the last video. If you want to go back and see that one, I talk about a little bit about the economy and how it works. The general idea is we need to buy stuff in the economy that gives money to businesses. Businesses take that money, invest it in hiring new people, building new products, and then selling those products. And then people have more money because they have these jobs and the jobs will pay higher and then they buy more stuff. And so we always bash us as we're a consumerist society. We're always like, oh yeah, we're all about consuming. Yeah, that's how the economy functions. That's how it works. And so the relief aspect is, oh crap, we need to have people have money so they can buy it. Because as recessions come closer, people stop buying stuff. If you don't feel confident about money coming in the future, you aren't going to buy stuff now. And that's usually a pretty good telltale sign that a recession's coming. So fireside chats are significant for FDR because what they, excuse me, it's him reaching out and communicating with the public. It's so obvious to us today because Trump tweets all the time, and you have candidates for president who will go live, like on YouTube Live or whatever, any other social media, Facebook Live, and we have this relationship with them, and that's so normal. That was not a thing. And now FDR is talking to people on the radio and they can listen and they feel this connection with the president. That was groundbreaking for the time. We do this a lot with like celebrities, and that's why if any of you want to get into building your brand and stuff like that. And I think even in class the other day, we joked about this, those of you who were in my spring class. It was, you got to make constant messages and reach out to people every day. And so you build that connection with them and those people feel like you are interacting with them and that gets them to buy into you. That's what FDR does with the fireside chats. And he's kind of the first to really do this, especially on a presidential level. It's alphabet soup for all of these things. I don't have time to go into all of the everything. I don't think the exam will be too picky on it. I would know about the big broader ideas and how they impact it. And then know a couple from each of the R's that you could drop in to make it seem like you know about a lot of them. So you got FARA, PWA, CCC, TVA, CWA, WPA, the gist of all of these is we need to get people back to work. And a lot of this is what we'd call infrastructure jobs. So CCC is Civilian Conservation Corps. Let's go get people out building stuff in like the Pacific Northwest. Some of that money goes home to their family. So the people can buy stuff who are working because it's typically young men. And then the family can buy stuff back wherever the family lives. So we think of that like building houses, doing that sort of thing, bridges, roads. But you also had aspects where like in the Work Progress Administration, where you go, oh, well, what about all those other people who have skills that's not building a bridge? How do we get them money? Artists are paid to paint murals. People are paid to put on stage productions. Journalists and writers are paid money to go interview the last generation of people who were enslaved about what their accounts were, purely because we need to put money into the economy and get it flooding out. So that's the relief idea. The recovery aspect, excuse me, the recovery aspect is, can we stimulate industry and farming? So the relief is the people, the recovery is industry and farming in this case. So the NRA, the AAA, the FHA, this is where he's going to face, FDR is going to face a lot of his challenges when it comes to the implementation of these policies, because it gets into a lot of, can the president do this? And so keep in mind this background and this argument of the president and the legislative branch, who has the authority over which of these things, because FDR is branching out into giving a whole lot more power to both the federal government and to the executive branch. And I think I mentioned this at the end of the last video. I'll say it again. This is deficit spending. That's what all of this is. This is the government spending money they don't have to get it to the people to boost the economy. We would adhere to that if we believe the government is supposed to help the economy and help regulate it and, you know, help us if terrible things happen. We see that in a Great Recession. We still significantly hold that as value today. I mean, if gas goes up or down, everyone yells at the president. It's not the president who does that, but we have this belief now that the federal government's job is to protect the people, specifically when it comes to the economy. The reform is about fixing American institutions so that you can prevent future depressions. I always am really like critical of America for not learning from its past mistakes. We learned from our past mistakes for this one. The handling of the Great Recession is way better than the handling of the Great Depression, because we had the Great Depression and we learned about that. And I'll talk about that a little bit in Unit 9 when we get there. You got the Glass-Steagall Act, you got the FDIC, the SEC, NLRB, which you also face some challenges with, and Social Security. The idea behind this, excuse me, and Social Security also works as a relief because it's, well, old people aren't building bridges, so how do we get them? They don't. What do they do for a job? And so Social Security is a pat on the back. Good work out there for your whole career. Here's some money. But it's also going to be a reform aspect in that we are preparing people to be able to be retired and not have jobs. So it kind of does double duty there. Social Security is not going to work for you unless the government changes it. It is going to be, the last I saw was 2030. I think they'll run out of money. So that's me too. I'm not going to be retired by 2030. So yay. Anyway, FDIC, if you've ever walked into a bank or heard a bank commercial, that's there. The government is going to, basically, there's insurance on the money you put in the bank. I love the cartoon of it's from the Great Depression. There's a guy sitting on a park bench and there's a squirrel in front of him. And the squirrel says to him, why didn't you save up money when times are good? So basically this is a little bit of like blame the victim. But sure, the stock market crashes, things fall apart, and you know, bad things happen. And so the squirrel's mentality, and this is what a lot of people would say, is, well, you need to be prepared for this. So it's your fault that you're not ready for it. And the guy's got something in his briefcase that says victim of bank failure. And he says, I did. Because he did. He saved his money. He didn't do this reckless spending. He wasn't buying on margin or doing any of those things. And yet he still got screwed because the bank that he had his money in failed. And now all his money is gone. So I like that cartoon because it shows two things. One, America's always about blaming the victim. It's going to be your fault. And I mean, Hoover did this. Get yourself out of it. Like, fix it. It'll be fine. Work harder. But then it also shows that significance of banks and why they're super important. And so the FDIC is going to keep people trusting in banks so you can get those investments going, but also so that you don't have okay, again, victims of economic collapses, it's not really their fault. It's always bigger. But in this case, people who didn't participate in the calamity and leading up to it being hurt by it. So you have that. Now, not everyone is a fan of FDR. Here are some critics that you have for this. Huey Long will be the big one. He's part of Share Our Wealth. So the critics are either you're going too far or you're not going far enough. And Huey Long is you're not going far enough. He has an idea of what is essentially universal basic income. You're going to see that be talked about more and more throughout Europe. And you're also going to see it pop up, I would argue, in the 2020 presidential nomination process. And universal basic income, or his Share Our Wealth, is we're going to give every person in America a flat amount of money. So I think Andrew Yang is running on a platform of $1,000 a month to every adult, and it would replace other parts of welfare. And Huey Long is saying this money is coming from those rich and established, and then money will come down for that. That's kind of like socialism. I mean, really, that's what we're talking about. You're redistributing the wealth. Socialism isn't that scary at this time period. You're going to see literally during this time, you have the rising up of the Soviet Union, and you're seeing these clashes in Germany between different groups about, are we going to be fascist? Are we going to be socialist? What is it going to be? So you see this back and forth about that. So it doesn't really have the taboo that it's going to have in 15 years. Father Charles Coughlin is on the radio. He's very anti-Semitic. I mean, this is kind of, and Dr. Francis Townsend as well. It's fake news. I mean, they're getting on television. They're getting on the radio, and they're talking about stuff that isn't true, and they're spreading conspiracies, and they're being anti-Semitic, and yep, that's fake news. So when we have our soul-searching moment with Facebook in the 2016 election, we're like, oh my God, what are we going to do? We've never faced this challenge before. We have. It happens every time we have new technology. And his other big criticism is going to be his idea to pack the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court is chopping down a lot of the things that he's trying to do. America doesn't like that one. That is not something America tolerates. And I think it's interesting when you look at the 2020 campaigns, where people like Pete Buttigieg is coming out saying we need to change the number of Supreme Court justices. That's going to trigger a lot of people because of this tie back to FDR and the idea of court packing, because it makes it seem like you're trying to rig things in your advantage. So it'll be interesting to see how that is handled. When it comes to the effects, I'll leave this up here for a second. So I've got it broken down: political, social, and economic. Just because I can't do all of this off the top of my head, and I'll leave it here for a second. This does not end the Great Depression. The New Deal does not end the Great Depression. That's World War II. So I do just want to be clear on that. I have no idea what's going to be on the test. I would say when you're thinking about things that they could use for that first short answer, so the dueling historians, I would pay attention to moments in American history where there are very clear disagreements. Reagan's a good example. The one from a couple years ago was Vietnam. That's a good example. I think the New Deal is a great example, deficit spending in general. So keep an eye out for those things where there is a very clear division between the conservative and liberal idea. Excuse me. And I think you're going to see that be used more and more, because they want something that's clear in the opposing nature of it. So maybe that's who started the Cold War, or any interpretation like that. So keep an eye out for things like that. Political things that I have up here. It is the first time you see the federal government take care of the welfare of the people. Like, it's the job of the federal government to make sure you're doing okay. That's so the norm now. That is so expected. If you, again, I keep harkening to the 2020 nomination process for the Democrats, because I mean, they're campaigning on these things. And so we're seeing where do we think the public is going in the future, because that's what they're doing. They're advertising themselves, and they're trying to say things that they think people would believe. And Elizabeth Warren and others have talked about free college, getting rid of student debt. And this is all the liberal side, obviously, and the conservatives are, going to say different things. But that is, the government needs to take care of me. They need to make sure, and we're talking about now healthcare during the Obama administration, and then getting into the idea of, are we going to have universal healthcare for everyone, like some other European countries have? And where do we go? Is it no student debt? Is it free college? Where does that go? Is it you give me a certain amount of money every year? How are they going to handle the automation of jobs. And so this is something that is a really, really big deal in American history, and you can track it throughout all of politics. And I bring that up because they love trends. And if you can, this is great contextualization. If you have a question somewhere else and it talks about the role of the federal government or the state government, you can pull this in as a way to connect to it. So always keep that in mind for your contextualization, and even some complexity depending upon what the question asks. There's going to be a new voting coalition for the Democratic Party. You're going to see unions, African Americans, immigrants, and poor voters. That's where you're going to see this shifting of Black voters from traditionally the Republicans because of the party of Lincoln and ending slavery, and shifting more to the Democrats. Also a little ironic at the time that you have Democrats in the South who are actually really conservative in mentality on the issue of race and things like that. So it's a little bit of an interesting situation. For social, we're helping new groups of people, the elderly, single mothers, disabled citizens. Eleanor Roosevelt is going to campaign to help minorities. By no means, though, does this mean that the New Deal was great for people of color. They're going to be the last hired, first fired. Social Security workers who worked in the South. So people of color in the South, if you've seen the movie The Help, did a lot of domestic servant work. Those jobs, they was not part of Social Security, so they would not receive those benefits. And that's, I mean, that was racist. That was designed that way. Excuse me. For economic, they're going to help relieve unemployment because we're getting jobs to these people. There will be some long-term economic reforms that I'll mention when we get to Unit 9. But as I mentioned, it doesn't end with the Great Depression. The thing that does that is World War II. Excuse me. World War II, there's a global economic crisis. The Great Depression wasn't just America, it's the world. And what happens is people start seeing this. So I, again, mentioned this before at the end of the last video, but when we fall into the Great Depression, we start pulling back all the aid we were giving to Germany. And by aid, I mean loans, because we were helping them make back the reparation payments, which was helping Europe in general. So we pull back on that. We jump up tariffs. Everyone throws up tariffs, and then the whole economy is not plugged into it itself. And so then globally, we're all like fighting for ourselves against each other instead of working together. And I would like to point out, you're trying to sell stuff. And in order to sell stuff, you want more people. But what each group did was they said, well, no, I want to make sure people buy from me. And so I'm going to protect my industry. And then that doesn't help anyone. So that's going on. People are really scared of what we're going to do. We see a rise in totalitarianism, and also the Treaty of Versailles, which I had mentioned before, is going to be a predominant cause of World War II. Hitler, okay, excuse me. He's going to play off of the Treaty of Versailles and all of this tension going on in Germany. The Weimar Republic is going on at this time. It is entirely ineffective. See me in person if you want to know more about that. I had to write my college paper on it. And I know way too much about the Jewish experience of Weimar Germany, but I'll gladly talk to you about it. You can read my paper if you want. But I don't have time for all that. So we're just going to talk about, they attempted to open things up. You see Jews rise up more in social status, and then terrible things are happening. And so everyone's like, oh, it's the Jews' fault. And it wasn't. They rose to power right when things got bad, and then everyone blamed them because they're an easy scapegoat. He believes in Lebensraum, living space. We need to go get land. And this is all the Aryan idea and, blonde hair, blue eyed, the German people, all of the racial components in that. That's what he wants. So he wants that unification of Germany and going out and getting land that was Germany's. And that's going to be what ends up leading into World War II. He campaigns on a policy of bread and jobs. I don't have time to talk about how all exactly it is the New Deal, but it's really, really similar to the New Deal. It's deficit spending. We're going to pour money into the government and into building back up the government, into the military and building back up our military. And then we're going to then funnel that money back into the economy, and then we're going to pick things up. And it works. I mean, it works in the idea that unemployment goes down and he gets the people bread and jobs. And like, I'm not here trying to defend people voting for the Nazis and things like that, but we tend to look at it with like, they're evil people. And I think that's a simplistic view of it. And so there's a reason of why on earth would people support that. And it's the reason why people flooded to the polls to get FDR elected, because he was going to fix things and people wanted to be saved. And Hitler campaigns on that and he fulfills that promise. Now, not for everyone, obviously, and it's terrible for the rest of the world, but that is why one of the reasons why he gets elected. He becomes chancellor and then is like dictator and then takes over, and then that's kind of probably where you expected him to be anyway. And you're going to start seeing that territorial expansion. You have the policy of appeasement that'll go on, and excuse me, Europe desperately does not want a war. Like, they're in the middle of a Great Depression, worldwide depression, and then like fight a war on top of that? No. And so they follow a policy of appeasement. And we look at appeasement much like if you ever saw the Dr. Seuss cartoon where there's a person standing on an island with lollipops and he's like, okay, and surrounded are all these monsters and they got swastikas on them and they're like all hungry. And he's like, one more lollipop each and you go home. And you're like, what an idiot. That's never going to work. And, you know, we think about this all the time, but I guarantee you at some point as a kid, you were yelling for something and one of your parents was like, okay, fine, take it, shut up, like just stop. And they knew that wasn't the best long-term discipline working. And so they were like, please, we don't want war. And they honestly hoped it would, you know, not lead to war, and yet it did. So I think it's too simplistic to look at them and be like, what a bunch of idiots. We know that wouldn't work. I think that's a bit simplistic. Here are some of the totalitarian dictators at the time. Excuse me, Mussolini's in Italy. Franco is in Spain. You're going to have a civil war there. That's really like pre-World War II. It's one of those wars right before a war where we get to see, hold on, things might be really bad, like the Russo-Japanese War before World War I, or heck, even some of the Civil War before World War I. You start seeing the idea of trenches in the Civil War because we can aim now, and you can reach out across a field and shoot someone specifically because you wanted to shoot them. And so people start ducking behind stuff and building up trenches and things like that. Then you introduce machine guns and we're way better at killing people. Well, when you get to World War II, we have planes that can fly way better than they were flying in World War I and can do way more than they could have done in World War I. And so Guernica by Picasso is a great example. This is art from that time period. You're going to see bombing of civilians. We're going to talk obviously about the atomic bombs and we kind of stop at that. But Germany bombed the crap out of England. We bombed the crap out of Germany. We bombed the crap out of Japan. And then we drop atomic bombs on Japan. So yeah, there's a whole lot of attacks on civilians during this World War II. You got Stalin in the Soviet Union, and then Hideki Tojo in Japan. Excuse me. I'm not going to spend a whole lot with the whole war. We're just going to look at the American part. Again, there probably won't be a lot of actual war questions. I think I have heard, we'll just say it at that, I have heard that there weren't any on the last exam about this. I don't think there'll be a lot, so I'm going to go through it a little bit quicker. Another example of America learning from mistakes. We learned about why we got into World War I, and that sucked, and we didn't want to do it again. So we don't do that for World War II until we purposefully then change our mind because we want to get into World War II. So we have the Neutrality Acts 35, 36, 37. Basically, it just knocks out all of the reasons why we got into World War I. So if we're looking at 35, the president can prohibit arms sales and U.S. travel to belligerent nations. No more Lusitania. Also, we don't have to worry about, are we playing one side more than the other by selling arms? Excuse me. 36, no extension of loans or credits to belligerent nations. Again, we can't play favorites because we're not loaning any money. And then 37, forbid the shipments of arms to opposing sides during the Civil War. So the same policy we'd had an idea, but now a specific reference for it. We are not getting involved. And then we decide we kind of have to get involved, and things kind of change, both with the Civil War and as we see this growing threat in Germany. And we'll have cash and carry. This is implemented in 39 as you have the war going on. We will let belligerent nations buy weapons from us, but they have to pay for them and come and pick them up. So again, we won't get into the Lusitania situations. They need to come and pick them up. And it also prevents us a little bit from playing favorites because they're coming to us. You could choose to come to us or not. Again, it's favorites. Like, we like Britain. We don't like Germany. Like, that's generally what we're looking for. Then when Britain is really up against it with the Blitz and things like that, we introduce Lend-Lease because they don't have enough money. And so we are willing to allow them to obtain arms on credit. This is when all of the neutrality goes out the window. It's kind of done at this point. There's the Atlantic Charter. There's a meeting between Churchill and FDR. And they are all talking about what are we going to do at the end of the war, about how to set up peace and things like that. There's an idea during this time period that you'll also see during containment a little bit, and it's the notion that FDR wasn't really afraid that the Nazis were going to come like attack America and destroy America. He was afraid it was going to have an impact on the other nations, and that would have an impact on us. And so that's why we should get involved. You see that similarly with communism. The idea maybe communism isn't going to root from doing whatever it is that we want to do. Excuse me. All right, so U.S. and the war. I'm just going to go through this quickly. Pearl Harbor. That was bad. And so we decide to get involved in the war. We declare war. Germany then declares war on us. We're involved. We then spend a lot of time not really actively getting involved in Europe. That really irritates Stalin. So the big three are Churchill, Stalin, and then FDR. FDR kind of placates between them. Here's another good dueling historians. Was he a skillful diplomat in his ability to excuse me, in his ability to like be nice to Stalin, but was he really leading him on and he was doing that? Or did he really like not acknowledge that the Soviet Union was going to be a problem? That's all some problems. We finally get involved in Europe because he wanted us to start a European front, because they're fighting in the Soviet Union. Island hopping in the Pacific, war. Cool. For the home front, we have internment camps. That's a kind of a big deal from this time period. There's some really racist Dr. Seuss cartoons if you want to chase those down about this. And excuse me, that's terrible. There are restrictions on liberties. Korematsu versus the U.S. deals with this specifically. What can the government do in times of war? And the answer is a lot. They can do a lot during times of war, and they can take away your liberties. You can trace that in a few other excuse me, you can trace that in a few other wars as well. Thinking like Schenck versus the U.S. and things like that, and the espionage and sedition and whatnot. There's propaganda. There's always propaganda in war. There's propaganda in this war. There's rationing that goes on similar to what you see in World War One. So there's that. The bomb. Excuse me. So this is part of a project called the Manhattan Project, and we kept this a secret. Like, we actually pilfered a lot of the Jews, the Jewish scientists from the Soviet Union who will like get run out. And this is a classic shoot yourself in the foot mentality. So because Hitler wasn't supporting the Jews and kicked them out, they come to America and help us build the atomic bomb, which if he had the atomic bomb, like things would have been so different. So that was a mistake on his part. We won't complain. We don't tell Stalin about this, but we do tell Churchill. Stalin doesn't find out until Potsdam when Truman's there, and Truman basically just alludes to that's when the successful test first happened. And Truman's like, look, I got this giant weapon and it's going to change everything. And that's when Stalin really feels backstabbed. FDR is dead, by the way. He dies. Sorry if that was a surprise to you. Excuse me. So we drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There's some decent dueling historians' opinion on whether we should have or should have not. And this will usher in the atomic age. The world is ever changed because of the atomic age, and we are so used to it. Like, okay, when Trump and Kim Jong-un were going back and forth with Rocket Boy and all that, it's like, okay, like cool. We all kept working. We're like, oh, do we all end a nuclear holocaust? Who knows? But with the introduction of atomic weapons, there is always that existential threat hanging over all of us. Are we all just going to go up in a blaze and that's it? That's how the world ends. That's an option. Like, that could happen. And so that forever changes mentality of people. And we can't really appreciate what it's like before that because we've only experienced that. Coming out of World War II is the Cold War. That's going to be a policy of containment. You should know about the Iron Curtain. Churchill will complain about that. Excuse me. And let's see, I'll just put this up here for Truman and the Cold War. Truman plays a substantial impact in the creation of our policy of containment. Excuse me. You get the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan. Truman Doctrine is focusing on we are going to work with countries and provide military aid to help them fight back against communists. Something you should always keep in the back of your mind for where communism thrives is poor areas, because you are telling people, I am going to give you stuff and make your life better. That is always something they will hear. Absolutely. Yes, please. My life is terrible. Come make it better. That's not something wealthy people want to hear, because they'd be the ones paying this and they would go, well, that's not fair. I work to get mine, yada, yada, yada. So what we're afraid of after the war is over is there's a vacuum of power in Germany and a vacuum of power in Japan. And we're afraid that, oh no, communism is going to get rooted in there. And then that's going to just spread everywhere. And oh my Germany's destroyed Europe, and what are we going to do about those areas? They're all poor. We're going to want bread and communist. What are we going to do? And so we decide we need to be involved. This is a huge change in American foreign policy. We were always like, let's go. No, come back, come back. So, when manifest destiny, right? But we're kind of staying within here. And then imperialism, we're going out a little bit. World War I, we're going to Europe. And then we immediately come back, return to normalcy. Now we go, all right, World War II. Now let's make sure the world goes the way we want. And this notion of America being a policeman in the world starts here. It is interesting to note that we're kind of pulling away from that. A big component of Trump's campaign was we shouldn't be in these wars. We shouldn't be out there. Stick to America. And I see all the Democratic candidates saying the same thing. Pull on back. Let's focus more on America. So it'll be interesting to see how the world goes with America kind of pulling back a little bit. And Obama did that to a fair extent as well. The Marshall Plan is we're going to pump money into these European countries to make sure that they can stave off communism and make sure things go well. There is the expanding of the Soviet Union. They're encroaching in Eastern Europe, and they are promising free elections and then not actually having free elections. China goes communist. That's a big threat to us. And that leads to the Korean War. Excuse me. The Korean War is our first kind of like test of containment. So the North attacks down into the South. We push to support the South. We actually push all the way up to China, and we're about to. So there's the idea of containment, right? Just put up a fence, don't let it spread. We got into the idea of rollback. Can we push back communism and take it out of areas, roll that back? And then China just unloads upon us, and then they helped, and then North Korea, and then pushes back, and we eventually settle where we were. But that's a success. Containment. We contained communism, and that will establish this precedent of containment. I didn't mention this. I do want to shout out George Kennan's long telegram. This is a huge foreign policy moment in American history. If you stay with me for a second, I'll pull up this quote. I was reading the Mueller report when it came out. I think we were on spring break at that point. And it was talking a lot about, so the first section, second part's all about Trump and whatnot. The first section is, what did Russia do to interfere with the election? And I'm going to try and multitask here. And what it talked about was they were like, all right, we're going to, they created like fake Facebook groups and Twitter accounts and whatnot, and spreading this information to just try and make people angry in America. And their whole issue was just to rile things up. They looked at race. They only supported Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump because Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are very controversial. And so they were like, whatever you do, this is their directive they gave down to their people. Whatever you do, don't mess with those candidates. Hate everyone else, destroy everyone else, but don't mess with those candidates. And oh, nope, I'm in the wrong unit. Shoot. Excuse me. And oh gosh, I'm falling apart here. And I just want to make one thing clear. So George Kennan in his long telegram is writing from Moscow, and he's going, hey, like, I think Soviet Union is bad. I don't think they're doing a great job. And he like lays out this, it's a telegram, it's really long, but he lays out all of these problems that he foresees. And I do have it. All right, it's right here. So I'll put it there for a little bit and then I'll read a section of it. This is part of his long telegram. And he says that so the Soviet Union is going to try to undermine general political and strategic potential of major Western powers. Efforts will be made in such countries to disrupt national self-confidence, to hamstring measures of national defense, increase social and industrial unrest, to stimulate all forms of disunity. All persons with grievances, whether economic or racial, will be urged to seek redress not in mediation and compromise, but in defiant violent struggle for destruction of other elements of society. Here, poor will be set against rich, black against white, young against old, newcomers against established residents. That last part is we're going to pit people in America versus immigrants. We're going to pit white versus black, and we're going to pit, what did it say here? Poor against rich. That's Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, and Black Lives Matter. All of those are things that they help push and fuel with Antifa and things like that, because those are things that challenge America. And so there's tons of good contextualization you could talk about with this. Sorry, I got a little passionate about that, but that's that. All right. Anyway, back to what we were doing before. Excuse me. So this leads us into Unit 8. While I keep going, you can write any Unit 7 questions you have or stuff that we talked about, and then go there. As to this question about how hard the AP exam is, I don't know. I haven't taken it because they redid it in 2015 and it's all different. It is the second lowest pass rate of all AP exams. So there you go. But I don't mean to say that to discourage you, but I will say definitely treat it like you should be prepared and don't just be like, nah, I'll wake up and take it. There are other AP exams that are like that, but I won't say which ones. Eisenhower is going to be president next. I like Ike. He's part of what is going to be called modern republicanism. This is, we want to limit the federal government, but we also want to help people. I know there's a lot of questions about political parties and whatnot. So it's keeping this idea of federal government should be weaker, but they are taking on some of that welfare components. A lot of that's going to end as we get closer into Reagan and things like that. He has the idea of brinkmanship and massive retaliation. He goes, I have nuclear weapons. Why on earth would I want to waste traditional forces or conventional forces? He cuts down the conventional forces, pumps up the arms race, and then just threatens, all right, I'll like nuke you. Like no matter what you do, you try and rig elections, you try and nuke me, anything in between, I'll nuke you. We'll go to war. And that seems crazy to us, but that's what Eisenhower's policy was. And we don't have a nuclear war because of it. So that's something. He also calls out what he calls the military industrial complex. And we see this in the arms race, the space race. His argument was there are companies that are built upon there being war. And so they help perpetuate war so that they can make money. This whole argument is Obama is all Bush in the Afghanistan and Iraq war. Less so Afghanistan, more Iraq, and Dick Cheney and all of his investments in defense companies and Blackwater and things like that. So again, Unit 9. And he's also going to get us involved in the Middle East when it comes to dealing with communism. 50s culture. This is, so there's some of the things. Shout out to Burt the Turtle. He's very alert. Duck and cover. A wonderful video. You should definitely watch it. It's the idea that a school desk is going to save you from a nuclear bomb, or it'll just be like getting a bad sunburn. It's just all sorts of stuff. But it is, we need to help people deal with the fact that like, oh crap, this is really terrible. And I'm not going to lie, there's a lot of valid connections between that and school shootings. Like, are the policies we have in place really going to protect us if something went awry? And the government walks this line of, I don't know how to protect you, so we'll just try and make you feel like you're being protected. So there's a lot of connections you could talk about in that. There's a baby boom because soldiers came back from war, and yep. The 50s family is a nuclear family. Lots of really funny videos to watch here. I say funny in that they are like super not in our time period. A lot of gender ideas that we would disagree with today. But when we wonder where do these gender roles come from, you see it in those videos. One that I show is a dinner with a family. And it's like a brother and sister come home and he like immediately starts like poking in the food and whatnot. And then he goes to do homework. And she has to get dressed, prepare the table, and help her mom make the food and prepare the food. And there's a line about how the women in the family owe it to themselves to dress attractive for the men in the family. Yeah. So there's that. There's also white flight in the suburbs. So we'll start seeing white people fleeing out of cities and then building up suburbs and then preventing people of color from moving in there. You see this in Levitt towns. And then eventually now we see gentrification where the reverse is happening. So white people, Yep. There's the second Red Scare. McCarthyism will be significant during this time period, going out and hunting up subversives. And we have this list of all of these spies who are going to destroy everything, and we need to root them out. Levitt towns are those communities that are being popped up and are, excuse me. It's like, okay, if any of you live in a subdivision, so like I built my house. A lot of the houses here look similar. There were only a few plans you could really pick from. That's what we're talking about, Levittowns. We're popping up houses because of the GI Bill and soldiers can buy stuff. And we have these cookie cutter subdivisions and you buy it and you fit in and we have our neighborhoods and things like that. This is the white picket fence, the family of four, all of that. Fun fact, Levitt, for Levittowns, super anti-Semitic, like really anti-Semitic. So there's a podcast called The Dollop that does a segment on this. It is rated R. There's language, but it does dive into kind of the history behind that and what happens when a white family buys the house to then purposefully sell it to a black family, and then like the whole community melts down because racism. Kennedy. So I have Marilyn Monroe on there because, yep. So Kennedy, you have the election in 1960. He runs against a young Nixon. This is the first time you'll see television really playing a significant role. And they have a debate and it's televised. And if you watched on television, most people were like, Kennedy won. And if you listen on the radio, you were like, Nixon won. And that's because, so it took a whole lot of light for television to work right. And so there's just these giant lights and they let off immense heat. And Kennedy's wearing makeup. So he doesn't sweat under these lights. And Nixon's like, I'm a man. Men don't wear makeup. And so he spends the entire time sweating and dabbing his forehead and things like that. And so it tells, and this is branding, this is visuals and how there's so important now as we get into television and media. And he's dabbing his forehead and it looks like he's sweating under the stress. Maybe he's lying, and that plays a significant impact. This election is super close, and Kennedy will win. The Kennedy's family is all sorts of messed up. I don't have time to go into all crazy messed up they are, but they're kind of messed up. I guess I won't say that because this is recorded and I don't want to say this. I have a line that I say in my classes about an aspect of their life in a video game. So you can see me in person and talk about that. But JFK is going to die. Robert Kennedy is going to die. And Ted Kennedy kills a woman. So there's that. Excuse me. I'm not going to say it. Sorry. Like, I have things I could lose, so I won't say that. Some significant things of Kennedy's presidency. The Berlin Wall is going to go up. You'll have the Bay of Pigs fiasco, where this is a continuation of Eisenhower. And what he does is, we trained these rebels who left Cuba to go back into Cuba and attack and kill Castro. This is the start of Black Ops, the video game. I don't know Spanish. I can't say that. Excuse me. And it's a disaster. It's a terrible disaster. Like we lose. It looks really awkward. He has to go before the world and be like, our bad. Like we tried to get Castro killed. And then you have the Cuban Missile Crisis, a little bit more positive for him. We do a flyover and we see missiles in Cuba and we go, oh crap, that's really close to us. And so there's this huge big showdown. About who's going to blink first, and the Soviets blink, and then they pull back their missiles from an embargo, and they pull their ships away, and we're like, yeah, we won. And then secretly what we did is we told them we would take our missiles out of Turkey because we did what they did before they did it. And we just didn't tell anyone about it. America. Also, very famously, Kennedy is shot in the head. He's killed. Lee Harvey Oswald kills him. I have a whole lot to tell about that story. I don't have time for that. So again, that's different time, different place. You have the civil rights movement. Tons of stuff on this. There's no amount of time that I could dedicate on this to give it the full impact that it has. I would obviously pay attention to all sorts of complexity with this. Those of you who are in spring right now, we're going to look at Blood Don't Sign My Name, which will really kind of pick this apart and how I do think there's a lot of good historian debates on this, we teach a version of the civil rights movement that is very much that peaceful nonviolence. White people saw black people protesting. We're like, you know what? That's right. You've earned it. We're going to give it to you. And that's not really the reality. And we also stop in like the 60s and we're like, the 60s, Martin Luther King, we did it. It worked. And we don't talk about the fallout in especially areas like the South, where you continue. And like, heck, how many things are happening now with police shootings and riots and protests and things of that nature, and violence? And we go, well, that's not appropriate. That idea, but then trickle it out to way more communities, is the fallout of the civil rights movement, of people of color going, nope, nope, like we didn't solve all of this problem. And then white people being like, no, no, you got your piece. We're done. We're going to move on to other stuff. And so it's definitely more complex than I say elementary school idea of, yay, sit-ins and we did it. It's a lot more complex than that. Definitely know about Martin Luther King Jr. and those nonviolent attempts, but then also keep an eye on things like Malcolm X. Keep an eye on especially other groups that pop up after this, because look, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. This is someone who said, we are going to be peaceful, nonviolent, and white people killed him. And that's when you see a significant amount of people, especially younger people, people of color coming up at this time period. They go, okay, we're done. We're not doing that. That did not work. We were getting killed for it. We're going to do something else. And you will see a clash between older people of color and younger people of color over how are we going to address this. You see that happen before in Booker T. Washington and W.E. Du Bois mentalities. So there's some contextualization you can throw in for those things. So keep an eye out for that aspect. I put it up here. I'll put it up again. Media plays a significant role. Presidents are going to play a significant role in the handling of this. Phenomenal use of the media by the civil rights movement to have like just the media show like horrific depictions of violence of white people against people of color who just aren't doing anything and are being peaceful. And that does shock a lot of America. And that does spur some change. A lot of sacrifice obviously went into that. We kind of gloss over that. We're like, yeah, but there was a ton of sacrifice that was put into this. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, but by no means does that just like end stuff. I didn't even put it in here, but you also are going to see Brown versus Board of Education, and then you're going to see desegregation of schools, except not really, because then schools hold on to it. And then you've got the Little Rock Nine, and how are we going to enforce it? And then, mayor standing up saying, not just mayors, governors standing up saying, segregation now, segregation forever. After this court decision. So it's definitely not just like, oh, the court's decided, yay, it's over. So it's very complex. Here's LBJ howling with the dog. That's what you wanted to see, I know. The Great Society, big push for LBJ in this. He has the awkward situation of he comes in for Kennedy and Kennedy's assassinated. And he tries to honor some of those things. And so tons of stuff in the Great Society. Definitely look that up. I'm not going to go through all of it right here, right now, but kind of be familiar with those domestic policies and those programs and the idea behind it. Vietnam's a big part of LBJ's presidency. There was a Vietnam, short answer, 3 years ago. So 2 years ago, whatever. So maybe not, but the probably will be, I don't know, whatever, I'm guessing. But that was there for the dueling historians a couple years ago. Gulf of Tonkin is going to start our like super involvement in the Vietnam War. We have presidents pushing in advisors back through Eisenhower. Just, we're not fighting, but we're sending in advisors. We're sending in aid. We're sending in advisors. We're not fighting. We're sending in advisors. Then the Gulf of Tonkin, we think we're being shot at. We're not. And then we go, oh my God, we're going to war. And Congress is going to give a tremendous amount of power to the president to fight wars. It'll then be taken away because we go, maybe that was a bad idea, but that'll be there. We send in ground troops. There's Rolling Thunder. You have the My Lai Massacre, the Tet Offensive, and the big one is the credibility gap. The big thing for Vietnam, and this is because I'll talk a little bit about the counterculture protest movement and the New Left in a second. The big thing going on excuse me, is the credibility gap. This is where we're seeing an administration not understand that they can't cover up information. And this will be the downfall of the Soviet Union as well, when they aren't allowed to, they can't censor stuff anymore because technology has moved too quickly. And that's Vietnam. Like, we're like, oh, people aren't going to know about the Vietnam War. We're going to have people fighting there, and then we'll be able to control the message. And the message is, we're winning, we're winning, we're winning. There are a ton of journalists who go over to Vietnam and write about what's actually happening. And they go, I don't know what they're talking about, but I'm here right now and we are not winning. And you're going to get the Pentagon papers that'll get leaked that'll point out, nope, no, we were not winning. And you see this credibility gap in this is lying. I mean, what they're doing is lying. They're saying we're doing this, and the reality is right here. You really see that in '68 with the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive is not a success for the Viet Cong. I mean, like, they do this giant push, and we kind of anticipated it, and we push them right back. We destroy them more than they destroy us. But it looks so bad because the administration has been saying, we beat them, we beat them, we beat them, we're beating them. And then all of a sudden they just all pop up attacking. And it looks bad visually, even though the reality is entirely different. And so say what you want about fake news and things like that. There is an argument to be made that perception is more important than reality. And because the administration had set up all these lies, it didn't really fix them, that reality was different. For 60s and 70s culture, you got protest against the Vietnam War. I'm not going to go into all the different phases of that, but it does start as a very like niche thing of, you know, crazy radicals, and then it slowly gets more and more mainstream, and it really starts shifting towards mainstream because of the draft. And people go, I don't want to fight. So the Draft Dodger Rag is a good example of that song where it's like, absolutely, I'm all for the war as long as I don't have to go fight it. Someone else go do that. So you'll see people dodging the draft, and that'll be a big form of protest. Protest is also a thing at this time period. You'll see the power movements going on. You'll see the protests for civil rights, obviously. So there is a lot of this upheaval. And we really need to keep in mind the 60s and 70s are a lot of that upheaval. And people don't do well with great change like that. And you'll see pullbacks to more conservative elements. And that's where Reagan will come from in the 80s, this pullback of maybe not. Excuse me. And even Nixon to some extent with the return to law and order, which is kind of code. Well, I'll get to Nixon in a minute. Music, tons of popular music comes about. Of course, there's devil music, and people, older people at the time were like, no, this isn't real music. You guys will say that to your kids about stuff. Well, whatever you're listening to, that's not real music, whatever. Hippies, obviously. You'll have the New Left, which is going to be like Students for Democratic Society, protesting on college campuses, saying things like, we want freedom of speech. Specifically, they're afraid that conservatives are silencing speech. And now the thing today would be conservatives upset that liberals are preventing freedom of speech on college campuses. So it's kind of both. The counterculture, sex, drugs, rock and roll. You'll see that in the hippies and things like that. But I don't want to oversell this. We look and we're like, hippies everywhere. They didn't make up the majority of the society. And so there is a good argument to be made, in the 2016 election is a good example of this, of the people making the most noise probably aren't the majority. And, you know, you had two media centers in LA and New York that were like, no, God, no, Trump's not going to win. We talked to all of our people, and all of our people were like, no, he won't win. And then he did, because the Heartland voted for them, and they weren't going out being super public about this. You see this mentality going on during, you know, the 50s and in the 60s and 70s as well. That's why you have a resurgence of conservatism. Nixon will become president. I like this picture. I'm not a crook. He was. Vietnamization is going to be him trying to pull out of the Vietnam War because people are not having it. So we're trying to get this push in of, we're going to have the Southern Vietnamese troops doing this fighting. And then he's also secretly bombing Laos and Cambodia. You get tons of leaks during his administration. There's a billion connections to make between Nixon and Trump besides just Watergate and things like that. There's a ton of leaks coming out of the administration. I don't have a ton of time to get into Watergate because I'm already at like 54 minutes here. So we'll just suffice it as, the bigger problem of Watergate wasn't the actual act that occurred. It was the attempt to cover it up. Tons of connections to Trump's administration right now. It's like, literally, the Mueller report was like, yeah, they didn't collude, but he did try to, on whether or not it's criminal or not, he did try and like stop this investigation and obstruct justice. And so this is a classic. If you're digging a hole, stop at some point. Don't keep going, because then you'll dig yourself in and you can't get out. Ford will become president because, well, I mean, Nixon resigns, so he doesn't get impeached. He immediately pardons Nixon. America hates him for this. We talked about two people trying to kill him because of this. One of them recently was living in North Carolina. So there you go. Stagflation is going on in the economy. That's a stagnant economy coupled with inflation. So the economy is terrible. You have an oil crisis because of OPEC, the oil and petroleum exporting countries. And look, we make the joke a lot about, oh, the war in Iraq was fought over oil. And I know we'll get to George W. Bush in a minute. But like legitimately, we expect the president to make sure that we have access to energy, and oil is a big one. You have the Helsinki Accords as well. Ford's kind of a failure. He's just kind of a failure. Then you have Carter. See the picture because he's a peanut farmer. Yeah, okay. You get it. An energy crisis here. Same thing that we saw under Ford. Also stagflation. He's also kind of a disaster. And this isn't like. A lot of people feel very, very dearly about Carter. He is a very sweet person. He did a lot of attempts for, he did a lot of attempts for moral rights and that sort of idea. And yet, he's not really successful. So sorry. He focuses on human rights. He goes to give back the Panama Canal, except he says we'll do it later, but give back the Panama Canal. You have the Camp David Accords, but you have big ones like Détente's over. Détente will end under here. You'll see the Soviets push into Afghanistan. Charlie Wilson's War is a movie that you can watch about this. And what we do is we want to help fight the Soviets. So we give rocket launchers to Afghanistan, and then they fight them. And then when we go into Afghanistan to fight them, they use those against us. So America. Excuse me. And the Iran hostage, they overthrow the embassy, they take a bunch of people hostage, and Carter very famously can't get them out. It's kind of a disaster, honestly. They get freed the moment Reagan's inaugurated. So yeah, Carter's not really that great. And then Unit 9, this will be 1980 up through modern times. Excuse me. Reagan. That's a good picture. You got to admit, that's a good picture. That's Reagan. That's good. That's good. Reagan is all about reducing regulation. This is a return to conservatism. He literally campaigns on the Let's Make America Great platform, which Trump does. Something that I've said ad nauseum, and I'll say it again. When you see progressive movements, you're going to see conservative backlash. You see progressive movements in the 60s and 70s, you're going to see a backlash with conservatism. You see progressive push during the Obama administration, you're going to see a conservative backlash with Trump. And there are examples of that happening. American progress typically is linear, it's up, but we do this. But we generally do go up in terms of making things more progressive. No comments? I thought there'd be more love for the That's So Reagan picture, but okay. All right. Big thing for him is the economy. Lower taxes, reduce regulations. This is Reaganomics, supply side economics, trickle down economics, that whole thing. A ton of stuff that you could have a historian debate over this. He's also going to strengthen our foreign policy with SDI, INF. The fall of the Soviet Union will happen here. He's also going to push for the war on drugs,